In welcoming you back to this eConference looking at Pope Francis, we again acknowledge the sponsorship, the gold sponsorship of Catholic Church Insurance. We continue to invite your questions and also invite you to listen to the next of our speakers. We are going to be welcoming Sister Monica Cavanagh RSJ. She is currently the congregational leader of the Sisters of St. Joseph in Australia. She has more than 40 years of religious profession behind her. She was the third of 10 children born to a family in Allura in Queensland, Australia. Her ministry has covered a wide range of different activities under the banner of the Sisters of St. Joseph, and she's here today to talk about an issue that I think is particularly pertinent to looking at Pope Francis and I suppose to the continuing role of the Catholic Church. And that is the role of women. As we welcome Sister Monica, she's going to talk about Pope Francis seeking the wisdom of women. Thank you, Sister.
Thank you, Mike. In my presentation today, I'd like to consider Pope Francis's leadership from the perspective of a woman. Over many years now, I've experienced the emergence of the role of women within the Church. I have grown up in a post-Vatican II Church community, and this has shaped my spirituality, my theology, my understanding of Scripture and ministry. I bring to my ministry as congregational leader many experiences of being a woman in today's church. I have served in pastoral roles at both parish and diocesan levels. In reflecting on Pope Francis modelling the ministry of Peter through my eyes as a woman in leadership, I will share what inspires me about Pope Francis's leadership and what he is saying about the role of women within the Church from his perspective. I will do this by looking at his particular references to the role of women, the challenges to be faced, and what I consider to be hopeful signs for the future. Speaking to my heart as a leader is Pope Francis's deep conviction God's heart has a special place for the poor. These words capture the direction Pope Francis's leadership has been taking since the beginning of his papacy. At the time of his election, I was with a group of people awaiting the news of who would be our new Pope. I wondered what difference this would make to a church shattered by abuse and declining in membership in the Western Church. One memory I hold from that day was his first gesture from the balcony. He appeared and we were introduced to Pope Francis, and I immediately thought of Francis of Assisi, whose call was to rebuild my church. Was this the man who would rebuild our church? And then he humbly invited the gathered faithful to pray for him, to give him their blessing before he blessed the crowd. And this gesture signalled for me a change, a moment of hope that something new would emerge. The following are qualities of Pope Francis's leadership that speak to my own heart. From the first moment of his papacy, Pope Francis indicated that serving with a heart full of love was a priority. In his homily on the day of his consecration as Bishop of Rome, he spoke these words: "The Pope must open his arms to protect all of God's people and embrace with tender affection the whole community of humanity, especially the poorest, the weakest, the least important, those whom Matthew lists in the final judgment of love, the hungry, the thirsty, the stranger, the naked, the sick, and those in prison." This has been manifested in his gesture of reaching out to those in prison, to refugees and migrants, to the sick, the marginalised, the unemployed, and most recently to the victims of sexual abuse. A leader indeed with a heart for the poor. This choice for those most deprived in society speaks to the heart of religious women and those working for justice in our church and our society. It reminds me of the call of so many religious founders, and in particular my own founder, Mary MacKillop, who encouraged us to seek first the poorest, most neglected parts of God's kingdom. A particular issue facing our world today is that of human trafficking. Pope Francis, in his exhortation, The Joy of the Gospel, states, "I have always been distressed at the lot of those who are victim of various kinds of human trafficking." The International Women's Leadership Conference has over recent years made this as one of the key priorities. And here this has been taken up in Australia by religious women through the work of ACRIF, Australian Catholic Women Against Trafficking. And I'm proud to say that some of my sisters are involved in addressing this issue. Another appeal of St. Francis for me is his use of language. He calls us to be missionary disciples, to be women and men who are credible witnesses to the joy of living the gospel, even at times if this takes us to the heart of the cross. He invites us to sit at the feet of Jesus in order that we may go out to meet God in the midst of the world, to be a leaven in the midst of humanity. All cultures and the church on the street are places for encounter with God. Pope Francis has been there. He's lived there. He has been one with his people. He's experienced the joys and the sufferings, and he's laughed and wept with his people. And it is within this reality that his mission heart has been formed. Pope Francis also brings a discerning heart, formed in his Jesuit training, into considering the reality of everyday life for wounded humanity. In The Joy of the Gospel, he invites preachers to keep their ear to the people and to discover what it is that the faithful need to hear. He said, a preacher needs to contemplate the word, and he also needs to contemplate the people. This is applicable to all in their leadership roles today, to listen with the ears of our hearts, to be attentive to the movement of the Spirit in our deliberations and our decision-making, and to approach life with the gaze of the shepherd. Perhaps one of his most memorable statements was his advice to pastors to be shepherd who smell like their sheep. Pope Francis is alert to the realities and situations which are being faced by people in different parts of the world. He's showing us, through his actions and movements, that he has a pastoral heart. His first visit outside Rome was to the tiny island of Lampedusa, after the drowning of many refugees. Gathering with the people, he spoke these words, "When a few weeks ago I heard the news, which unfortunately has been repeated so many times, the thought always returns as a thorn in my heart that brings suffering. And then I felt that I ought to come here today to pray, to make a gesture of closeness, and also to reawaken our consciences so that what has happened would not be repeated." In his recent visit to the Ostelli Refugee Centre in Rome, he singled out a Syrian family to hear the present emergency in their homeland. He also gave time to a Sudanese refugee. And during his visit to the Holy Land, he visited a Palestinian refugee camp, placing the refugee crisis as a major focus for this time. Can his pastoral heart touch the response of Australia to this issue? It's not surprising that Pope Francis's exhortation is titled The Joy of the Gospel. His whole demeanour speaks of a man deeply in love with God, free to be himself and filled with the joy of living, which he states is at the heart of ministry today, to be bearers of good news. His very presence has caught the imagination of the world. His smiling face speaks of a man who knows that he is the beloved of God, a man who has come to know the God who weeps in times of suffering and natural disasters, and who in times of celebration rejoices with us. He has pondered deeply the virtue of joy. I have a sense that when people encounter the smiling face of Pope Francis, their hearts are uplifted with joy. And I sense what keeps the smile on Pope Francis's face is the many human encounters that cause him to reflect. Today I met God in the feet of a prisoner, the tears of a refugee, the disfigured face of a young child, the bereaved mother, and in the faces of people of all cultures. Like Pope Francis, I hold dear the virtues of compassion, humility, and simplicity. His desire to be trusting of people in their circumstances of life resonates with my own desire to provide a space for all those within my sphere of influence to choose life. I trust and hope that in my role in leadership, I shall be closely in tune with the pulsating heart of God, breathing joy, love, attentiveness, compassion, and life at this moment in the history of the Church, in my congregation and in the world, so that I too, like Pope Francis, will become a facilitator of grace. Over these past months, I've been listening to people's responses to the Francis effect. He's caught the imagination of people, and I've been particularly keen to hear the voice of women. These were some of the things that I heard. Pope Francis brings a freshness. This is the first time in ages that I've been interested in reading a papal document. He's restored my faith in the Church by his openness and willingness not to judge. I love the fact that he speaks and acts from the heart. He lives and breathes the heart of the gospel. And as the reporter Alice Laffey noted, throughout the world, women and their children make up the greatest percentage of human beings living in destitution. Their main concern is not women priests, but food, health, education and physical safety. Francis's genuine concern for the real lives of the poor and suffering warmly embraces women. When he visited the juvenile prison in Holy Week and washed the feet of the young prisoners, including the feet of 2 young women, many onlookers noted that this gesture signalled for them there was a place for women in the Church, which Pope Francis would lead. One writer titled a reflection, "Women have feet too." This visit was shortly followed by an Easter reflection in which he stated that women, the first witnesses of Christ's resurrection, have a special role in spreading the faith. Women have had and still have a special role in opening the doors to the Lord. The women were the first witnesses. And he went on to say, only men are remembered as witnesses of the resurrection, the apostles, but not the women. This is because, according to the Jewish law of the time, women and children were not considered reliable, credible witnesses. In the gospel, however, women have a primary fundamental role, the first witnesses of the resurrection. And I'm sure these words caused for some women a leap of joy. Here the voice of women in the scriptures was being confirmed and proclaimed. For some time now, women scripture scholars have been giving voice to biblical women, allowing the richness and deeper meanings of text to be opened and explored, showing us that women's roles have a place where God's presence has been manifest. In July last year, on his return from World Youth Day in Brazil, Pope Francis spoke briefly about the issue of women in the Church. He stated at this time that the door is closed with regard to women's ordination. But he went on to say, we cannot limit the role of women in the Church to altar girls or a president of a charity. There must be more. And he went on to speak of a more profound theology of women. Sister Simone Campbell, in the Time magazine, reflected that Francis's call for the creation of a deep theology of women provides an opportunity for him to read and reflect on the work of women theologians all over the world, writing about their experience and reflecting on the deep truths of our faith. On the occasion of the 25th anniversary of Pope John Paul's apostolic letter on the dignity and vocation of women, Francis once again drew attention to the role of women in the Church. He spoke about how deeply he feels it when the role of women becomes one of servitude rather than service. It raises the question, can women be valued more? Or, as he asked, what presence does woman have? This question has been reflected on by many women. What gift does the presence of women have in today's church? What might be different if this gift were truly understood and valued? This leads to the next reflection from Francis. Women can help provide better insight into the nature of God. Woman has a particular sensibility for the things of God, above all in helping us understand the mercy, the tenderness and the love God has for us. This statement provoked a memory in me of reading for the first time the book The Feminine Face of God, the unfolding of the sacred in women, discovering here a more wholesome and inclusive understanding of the nature of God, a God who reaches down to lift our cheek tenderly, who feeds us and nourishes us with love, like that of a mother with a child at the breast, who stands with us in the midst of suffering, like the woman who once shared with me how her image of God changed dramatically when she went through the struggle of postnatal depression, or the faithful catechist who, for so many children, is the way they gain a glimpse into the faithfulness of God. Let us listen to these voices, for they too will shape our understanding of God, theology and church. The voice of woman matters, Pope Francis said. We need to create still broader opportunities for a more incisive female presence in the church. Cardinal Walter Casper, in an interview, said the church reflected that there are areas in the church which do not require the jurisdiction of the ordained ministry. There are opportunities for women to serve in positions, both in the Curia and on the pontifical councils. There is a place for women in the decision-making bodies of the church, and he says, let us begin with what is possible. Kathleen Cummings of New York Daily News considered the influence of St. Clare on Francis of Assisi and wrote, the presence of a modern and visible Clare would go a long way in convincing many Catholic women that they too have a place at the table. Here I wish to express my appreciation for the ministry of those who serve through the Office of Participation of Women and groups such as WATAC, Women and the Australian Church, who keep the role of women in this country on the agenda of church and society. Sister Christine Schenck, Executive Director of Future Church, says that Pope Francis is doing great at the symbolic level since his election, but the proof will be in what steps the Vatican takes to begin to incorporate women's voices and experience at all levels of church ministry and decision-making. This is reiterated in an address Pope Francis gave on the 25th of January this year to an Italian women's group. He once again affirmed women's gifts and went on to say, I too have considered the indispensable contribution of women in society. I have rejoiced in seeing many women share pastoral responsibility with priests in accompanying people, families and groups, as in theological reflection, and I have expressed my hope that greater room can be made for a more capillary and incisive female presence in the church. What might be meant by this? A capillary is a tiny blood cell thousands of which are spread throughout our body. Perhaps what he's saying is this: there needs to be a more widespread and effective female presence in key decision-making bodies of the church. And then in his exhortation he said, demands that the legitimate right of women be respected based on the firm conviction that men and women are equal in dignity, present the church with profound and challenging questions which cannot be lightly evaded. So what are some of these profound and challenging questions? How do we as church address the many ways women are oppressed in our world, in situations where women's voices are silenced, like those in the recent hangings of the girls in India? How can we talk about an equality in dignity when women who are equally qualified, skilled and experienced as men are not yet involved in key decision-making levels of the universal church? How can the gifts of women be more recognised within the life of the church, considering that they represent more than half the congregation in many communities and are the sustainers of church ministry? How will Pope Francis engage with women leaders of religious congregations who bring a wisdom and integrity through their roles? How will he continue to dialogue in the current situation with the American Religious Women Conference, LCWR? What can be learnt about these women in leadership from the way they have responded with integrity? How will he translate his gestures and words into church governance structures and into the pastoral life of the church? So what are some of my hopes for the future? Well, Pope Francis' freedom to be himself, to live from the heart of the gospel, his commitment to be a church that is bruised, hurting and dirty because it has been out on the streets, and his deeply relational presence are what sustain my hope in the future. As he creates space for women's voices in the church, my hope is that he continues to reflect on how the leadership of women in the Gospels and the early church was exercised, that his words and gestures are able to be transformed into action, that he will continue to seek the wisdom of women through dialogue in appropriate areas of life, and that he is able to incorporate their wisdom, gifts, skill and expertise as he moves towards a more transparent, accountable and compassionate church, where the different vocations and gifts are complementary and mutually enriching. And perhaps one day, Martha's leadership and declaration of faith will be as honoured as Peter's. Thank you.